My name is Daisy, and I was 30 when I met Jacob. We both worked for Global Tech, a large international company. I was a translator, and Jacob worked in the IT department. Always ready with a joke or a helping hand when my computer decided to throw a tantrum, Jacob quickly became a constant presence in my day. It didn't take long for our coffee breaks to turn into dinner dates, and soon enough, we were inseparable. A year later, Jacob got down on one knee in the middle of our favorite park. The wedding was a whirlwind of white lace and champagne toasts. Jacob's parents, Amanda and Blake, seemed nice enough. Amanda hugged me tightly and whispered, "Welcome to the family, dear." If only I had known then what that welcome truly meant. After the honeymoon, we moved into Jacob's apartment. It was spacious and modern, with a view of the city skyline that took my breath away. "This is perfect," I said, twirling around the living room. Jacob grinned. "Wait till you see the kitchen." Mom insisted on getting all top-of-the-line appliances. When I first moved in, I should have paid more attention to those words. I should have asked more questions. But I was too caught up in the excitement of starting our life together. The first few weeks were bliss. Jacob and I fell into an easy rhythm, sharing chores and enjoying quiet evenings together. Then, one Saturday morning, it happened. I was in the kitchen, attempting to make pancakes, when I heard the front door open. Thinking Jacob had returned from his morning run, I called out, "Hope you're hungry, babe." But it wasn't Jacob who walked into the kitchen, it was Amanda. "Oh, hello, dear," she said, her eyes scanning the mess I'd made. "I thought I'd pop in and see how you two are settling in." I stood there, spatula in hand, completely stunned. "Amanda, how did you?" She dangled a key in front of me. "I have a spare, of course. How else would I check on my Jacob-me?" Amanda bustled past me, opening cupboards and peering into the fridge. I watched in disbelief as she pulled out cleaning supplies and started wiping down the already spotless counters. "But we're married now, you don't need to," I began. "Nonsense," she interrupted. "Jacob-me's still my boy, and I have so much free time these days. I'm happy to help." For the next hour, I endured a running commentary on my housekeeping skills, or lack thereof, according to Amanda. By the time Jacob returned, I was ready to scream. "Mom," Jacob said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" Amanda beamed at him. "Just helping Daisy get things in order, dear. You know how overwhelming it can be for a new wife." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Jacob shot me an apologetic look but didn't say anything to contradict his mother. The next few weeks were a blur of unexpected visits and unsolicited advice. Amanda seemed to materialize in our apartment at the most inconvenient times, always armed with a critique and a story about her own domestic prowess. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, she burst in without warning. "Oh, Daisy," she exclaimed, eyeing my neat piles of clothes. "That's not how you fold t-shirts. Here, let me show you." I gritted my teeth. "Amanda, I appreciate your help, but—" "Nonsense," she interrupted, already refolding a stack of Jacob's shirts. "I've been doing this for years. Did I ever tell you about my own mother-in-law?" Now, she was a piece of work. And so began another session of Amanda's favorite pastime, regaling me with tales of her own suffering at the hands of her mother-in-law. She used to come over unannounced, Amanda said, oblivious to the irony. Always criticizing my cooking, my cleaning, nothing was ever good enough for her. I bit back the urge to point out the similarities. Instead, I forced a smile. "That must have been difficult." "Oh, it was," Amanda nodded sagely. "But I endured it, and look how well Jacob-me turned out. You should be grateful I'm nothing like her." "Grateful?" "Right. Because having my privacy invaded and my abilities constantly questioned was such a blessing. As the days wore on, my patience wore thin. Amanda's visits became more frequent, her criticism more pointed. She'd run her finger along the top of the fridge, sneering at imaginary dust. She'd reorganize the pantry, claiming she knew best how Jacob-me liked things. Jacob, for his part, seemed oblivious to the tension. "Mom's just trying to help," he'd say whenever I brought it up. "She means well." But good intentions or not, I was at my breaking point. The constant intrusion, the endless criticism, the thinly veiled insults, it was all becoming too much. It came to a head one Sunday afternoon. I was in the middle of preparing dinner when Amanda waltzed in, key in hand. "Daisy, dear," she called out, her voice sickeningly sweet. "I thought I'd drop by and give you some pointers on proper meal planning. Jacob-me's always been particular about his Sunday roasts." I stood there, wooden spoon in hand, feeling something inside me snap. This was my home, my kitchen, my marriage, and I'd had enough. Taking a deep breath, I turned to face her. "Amanda," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "we need to talk." Her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "About what, dear?" "About boundaries," I replied. "About privacy. I appreciate your intention to help, but coming over unannounced, criticizing everything I do, it's not helping. It's making me feel uncomfortable in my own home." She left without another word, the door slamming behind her. As the sound echoed through the apartment, I leaned against the counter, exhausted but oddly exhilarated. That evening, as Jacob and I sat down for dinner, I knew I had to broach the subject. "Jacob," I started, pushing my food around on my plate, "we need to talk about your mother." He sighed, putting down his fork. "What's she done now?" I took a deep breath and recounted the day's events, along with all the other incidents that had been building up. As I spoke, I could see the conflict in Jacob's eyes, torn between his love for his mother and his commitment to me. "Daisy, I know Mom can be intense," he said carefully, "but she means well. She's just trying to help." I shook my head. "Jacob, I understand that, but this isn't help, it's control. She comes into our home uninvited, criticizes everything I do, and makes me feel like an intruder in my own life. It has to stop." Jacob ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "What do you want me to do?" "I need you to set boundaries with her," I said firmly. "Take back her key, ask her to call before coming over, and most importantly, I need you to stand up for me when she oversteps." There was a long pause as Jacob processed my words. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. I'll talk to her." True to his word, Jacob had a conversation with Amanda the next day. I wasn't present for it, but from what Jacob told me, it didn't go well. Amanda was hurt and offended, claiming we were pushing her out of our lives. But in the end, she reluctantly agreed to our terms. For a while, things seemed to improve. Amanda's visits became less frequent and were always preceded by a phone call. But the peace was short-lived. It started with little things. Suddenly, I found myself uninvited to Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. When I asked Jacob about it, he'd shrug uncomfortably. "Mom says it's just immediate family this time," he'd say, not meeting my eyes. The final straw came on Jacob's father Blake's birthday. Jacob and I had planned to go together to wish him well, but at the last minute, Jacob got called away on an urgent work matter. "You should still go," Jacob insisted. "Dad would want to see you." Hesitantly, I agreed. I rang the doorbell, gift in hand, and waited. When Amanda opened the door, her eyes narrowed. "Daisy," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." This is a family gathering, and let's be honest, dear, you're not really family, are you? Her words hit me like a slap. I stood there, stunned, as she continued. You've made it quite clear that you don't want me in your life, she said. So, I think it's best if you leave now. We wouldn't want any uninvited guests ruining Blake's special day. As if on cue, Blake appeared behind her. What's going on? He asked, looking between us. Amanda's demeanor changed instantly. Oh, Blake, she said, her voice trembling theatrically. Daisy here was just leaving. Isn't it awful how she's pushed me out of Jacobme's life? Taken away my keys, forbidden me from visiting my own son. I felt my face burn with anger and humiliation. That's not true, I protested. I only asked for some boundaries. Enough, Blake said firmly, surprising us both. He turned to Amanda, his expression stern. That's enough, Amanda. Daisy is family, and she's welcome here. He then looked at me, his eyes softening. Please come in, Daisy. We'd love to have you join us. Shocked and grateful, I stepped inside. Amanda, clearly furious, stormed off to the kitchen. As I followed Blake into the living room, I could feel the eyes of the other guests on me, curious about the scene they had just witnessed. The next few years were a constant battle with Amanda. Despite our efforts to set boundaries, she always found ways to insert herself into our lives. Then tragedy struck. Blake fell ill suddenly, his condition deteriorating rapidly. When he passed away, it felt like the world had shifted on its axis. The funeral was a somber affair, with Amanda stoically going through the motions, barely acknowledging my presence. After the service, Blake's lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a kind man who had been his close friend, approached us. Mrs. Walker, if you and your son could join me in private, Mr. Walker left some specific instructions regarding his will. When they emerged, the atmosphere had changed drastically. Amanda looked pale and shocked, while Jacob seemed confused and conflicted. As we drove home, Jacob finally broke the silence. Dad left everything to me, he said quietly. The house, the savings, everything. Even Mom's house. I was stunned. What? But why? Jacob shook his head. I don't know. The lawyer didn't explain. At that moment, I remembered Amanda's reaction. Her face had been a mix of disbelief and anger. I could have sworn I heard her mutter under her breath, "That fool," before composing herself. The next day, Amanda called Jacob, her voice trembling. Jacobme, you're not going to kick me out, are you? This house, it's all I have left of your father. Jacob's response was immediate. Of course not, Mom. The house is yours to live in, and I'll set up a monthly allowance for you. I didn't object. It was Jacob's inheritance, his money, his decision. And despite our differences, I couldn't imagine leaving Amanda homeless after losing her husband. However, our act of kindness did little to soften Amanda's attitude toward me. She stopped coming to our house, but her influence was still felt. She called Jacob constantly, always with some emergency or excuse for why he needed to come over. Jacobme, the sink is leaking. I think I heard a strange noise in the attic. I'm not feeling well. Could you stay the night just in case? Jacob, ever the dutiful son, would rush to her aid, often staying overnight. It was driving me crazy. As Amanda's birthday approached, I braced myself for another round of exclusion. For the past 2 years, I'd been pointedly uninvited from family gatherings, relegated to the role of an outsider in my own marriage. So when Jacob announced he had to leave on a last-minute business trip, I resigned myself to a quiet evening alone. I was surprised then when my phone rang the day before Amanda's birthday. Even more surprising was the name on the caller ID. Daisy, dear, Amanda's voice oozed sweetness through the speaker. I'm calling about my birthday celebration tomorrow, Amanda began, her voice unusually soft. I know we've had our differences, but I'm tired of all this hostility. I'd like us to reconcile. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, utterly dumbfounded. You want me to come to your birthday party? Of course, dear. I know Jacob me can't make it, but I'd love to see you there. What do you say? Part of me wanted to refuse outright. After years of snubs and barely veiled insults, why should I believe this sudden change of heart? But Amanda's voice sounded so sincere, so genuinely warm, that I found myself wavering. I suppose I could stop by, I heard myself say. Wonderful! Amanda exclaimed. It's at the Willow Creek Country Club. I'll see you at 7. The next evening, I found myself driving to the country club, a carefully chosen gift and a bouquet of flowers on the passenger seat beside me. As I approached the entrance, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. I pulled up to the security barrier, where a guard stepped out of his booth. Name, please, he said. Daisy Walker, I replied, trying to sound confident. The guard scanned his list, then frowned. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see that name here. There must be some mistake, I said, my anxiety growing. Amanda Walker invited me personally. I'm her daughter-in-law. The guard shook his head. I'm sorry, but if you're not on the list, I can't let you in. It's a private event. Flustered, I got out of the car and pulled out my phone to call Amanda. After a few rings, she picked up. Amanda, it's Daisy. I'm at the entrance, but they won't let me in. A few minutes later, I saw Amanda approaching the barrier, surrounded by a group of well-dressed guests. They were all laughing, glasses in hand, clearly enjoying the party, which was already in full swing. As Amanda neared my car, I expected her to clear up the misunderstanding with the guard. Instead, she fixed me with a cold stare that sent chills down my spine. Well, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. If it isn't the little gold digger herself. Did you really think I'd let trash like you into my birthday celebration? I stood there, stunned, as Amanda continued her tirade. I specifically chose this venue to keep out unwanted elements like you. Why are you even here? You're not family, you're nothing but a money-hungry tramp who trapped my son. The guests behind her tittered, clearly enjoying the show. I felt my face burning with humiliation and anger. But you invited me. I stammered. You said you wanted to reconcile. Amanda's laugh was cold and cruel. Oh, you poor, naive girl. I wanted to see just how desperate you were to get your hands on our family's money. And look at you, showing up like a stray dog begging for scraps. For a moment, I stood face to face with Amanda, seeing the malice gleaming in her eyes. Then, with deliberate slowness, I dropped the flowers and gift at her feet. Without another word, I got back in my car and drove away, Amanda's mocking laughter and the sounds of the party fading behind me. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from Amanda's cruel words and actions. As soon as I walked through the door, I collapsed onto the couch and called Jacob, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. Through tears and hiccups, I recounted the entire humiliating ordeal. Jacob listened in stunned silence, only interrupting occasionally to ask for clarification. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then Jacob's voice came through, low and angry. I'm coming home, he said, and then I'm going to have a very serious conversation with my mother. True to his word, Jacob was on the next flight home. When he arrived, he held me close, apologizing over and over for his mother's behavior. Then, with a determined look in his eye, he picked up the phone and called Amanda. I could hear Amanda's voice, shrill and defensive, through the speaker. But Jacob's responses were calm and resolute. "No, Mom, this time you've gone too far. I don't want to hear your excuses. You've humiliated my wife, the woman I love. No. I'm done. I'm cutting you off. No more allowance, no more help. You're on your own." For a week, we enjoyed a peace we hadn't known in years. No frantic calls from Amanda. No emergencies requiring Jacob's immediate attention. It felt like we could finally breathe. But, of course, it couldn't last. One afternoon, there was a knock at our door. When I opened it, I found Amanda standing there, her eyes red and puffy, her appearance disheveled. "How could you do this to me?" she wailed, pushing past me into the house. "I raised that boy. I devoted my entire life to him, and now, because of you, he's left me with nothing. No money, no support. I can barely afford to eat." She paced the living room, her voice rising hysterically. "It's all your fault. You turned him against me. You're the reason Blake disinherited me. You've ruined everything." I tried to interject, to defend myself, but Amanda was beyond reason. She continued her rant, tears streaming down her face, until she finally collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. After a few minutes, Amanda composed herself and left without another word, leaving me standing in the middle of the living room, confused and conflicted. As the door closed behind her, I made a decision. I needed answers, and I knew just who might have them. The next day, I found myself sitting across from Blake's lawyer in his office. The room was warm and inviting, with shelves lined with law books and framed diplomas on the walls. Mr. Thompson looked at me with kind eyes, his hands folded on the desk between us. "Mrs. Walker," he began, "I understand you have some questions about your father-in-law's will." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I do. I need to understand why Blake left everything to Jacob and nothing to Amanda. It just doesn't make sense." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, a conflicted look crossing his face. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "Mrs. Walker, I've known the family for a long time, and what I'm about to tell you, well, it's not pleasant. The truth is, Amanda had been unfaithful to Blake." I felt my jaw drop. "What?" "She had a lover," Mr. Thompson continued, "a man who passed away shortly before Blake's death. This man left Amanda a significant amount of property in his will." I sat there, stunned, as Mr. Thompson went on. "Blake found out about the affair and the inheritance. They had a terrible argument, and that's when he decided to change his will, leaving everything to Jacob." My mind was reeling. Amanda, who had always portrayed herself as the devoted wife and mother, had been living a double life. But Mr. Thompson wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his voice somber. "Years ago, when Jacob was just a boy, Blake's mother, Jacob's grandmother, fell ill. She had saved money for years to afford a place in a private nursing home where she hoped to spend her final days in comfort." I listened, a sense of dread growing in the pit of my stomach. Amanda convinced Blake to sell his mother's property and send her to a state-run facility instead. They kept the money for themselves and rarely visited the poor woman. She passed away not long after, alone and neglected. I felt sick. The Amanda I knew was manipulative and cruel, but this was a level of callousness I couldn't have imagined. "Blake carried that guilt with him for years," Mr. Thompson said softly. "I think changing his will was his way of trying to make things right, to ensure that Amanda couldn't do to Jacob what she had done to his mother." As I left Mr. Thompson's office, my head was spinning. The woman who had accused me of being a gold digger had been the real predator all along, pursuing her own interests at the expense of her family's well-being and happiness. That evening, when Jacob came home from work, I sat him down and recounted everything I had learned from Mr. Thompson. Jacob listened in stunned silence, his face a mix of disbelief, anger, and profound sadness. "I can't believe it," he said when I finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, she's been lying to us, manipulating us." We stayed up late into the night, talking through the implications of these revelations. Jacob was devastated but also resolute. "This ends now," he said firmly. We didn't have to wait long for Amanda to make her next move. A few days later, she showed up at our door, all tears and pleas for help. "Jacob, she began, her voice quavering. "I know you're angry, but please, I need your help. I have nothing left." Jacob's face was like stone as he replied, "That's not true, is it, Mom? We know about your lover, about the apartment and the money he left you." Amanda's face drained of color. What are you talking about?" "Drop the act," Jacob said, his voice cold. "We know everything, about your affair, about what you did to Grandma, all of it." Amanda's demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the pitiful, pleading woman. In her place stood someone I recognized all too well, calculating, angry, and ready to lash out. "How dare you," she shrieked. "After everything I've done for you. You ungrateful, selfish boy." Jacob didn't flinch. "Ungrateful? You're right, I am. Unlike you, I won't be sending you to a state nursing home to die alone." Amanda recoiled as if she'd been slapped. Jacob continued, his voice steady. "I'm selling the house. You need to leave. Use the money and property your lover left you and stop trying to deceive and use everyone around you." Amanda's indignant screams could probably be heard down the block, but Jacob remained unmoved. He gave her a deadline to vacate the house, and true to his word, he sold it soon after. We later learned that Amanda had moved into the apartment left to her by her lover, evicting the current tenants and having to pay a hefty sum for breaking their lease. She tried calling Jacob a few times after that, alternating between tearful pleas and angry accusations, but we stood firm in our decision to cut ties. As the dust settled from this tumultuous period, Jacob and I found ourselves looking toward the future. And what a future it was shaping up to be. I was pregnant. We decided to sell our apartment and look for a small house, somewhere we could raise our child in peace, away from the shadows of the past. We were careful not to let any news of the pregnancy or our plans to move reach Amanda. The last thing we wanted was for her to find a way back into our lives, especially with a baby on the way. Driving away toward our new home and new life, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't experienced in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew Jacob and I would face them together, stronger for having weathered the storm.